Considering how many champions are playable in League, if I were to give credit where it's due, it's nothing short of impressive that Riot's been able to condense all of them within about a 3 to 4% range of each other. There have been a few instances of a champion escalating way past what is appropriate, but by and large, it's unusual to see a champion with the win rate above 55 or below 45. Naturally though, it's bound to happen every once in a while. Way back in Seasons 3 and 4, Kassadin was one of the few champions in the game's entire history to have a win rate so high and necessitated a ban rate of quite literally 100%. He was so overpowered not a single game took a chance in allowing him to be played in either solo queue or pro play. In response to this, Kassadin was slammed with arguably the harshest sequence of nerfs during that time, rendering him a shell of his former self and plummeting his win rate all the way from like 60% into negative, subsequently causing many to label him as the weakest champion in the game. Over the years, the Balance team has made efforts to allow him to be viable without reenacting his glory days, yet it seemed like he would only ever be offensively strong or offensively weak, never in between. Further, his pick rate would see noticeable fluctuations as well, but given his ostensibly easy gameplay and extreme carry potential owing to his scaling, many players gave him a try over the past decade, and he stood comfortably between a 5 to 10% pick rate, one of the more consistent mid-lane presences throughout that time. The past couple years, however, saw a noticeable drop in popularity for the Voidwalker, and though his win rate did stabilize, Kassadin has never been more obscure now than he was before. So in today's episode of Why No One Plays, we'll be investigating what happened that made him go from one of the most terrifying mid laners in the game to one of the least relevant in the current age. Kassadin would be characterized by many as a hypercarry, a champion whose skin often features additional tools that can reinforce their natural scaling through levels and items, and even compound on each other to result in parabolic jumps in strength. An easy way to tell if someone scales in the mid to late game would be if they not only get stronger in damage or durability, but also have another metric that can increase, such as uptime or range, or potentially a secondary attribute that also leads to multiplicative amps in power. When allowed to obtain their optimal power level, hypercarries uncontestedly stand head and shoulders above the competition, capable of exerting pressure and kill force equivalent to 2 or sometimes 3 champions. They are without question the most dangerous opponent on the enemy team and can single-handedly decide the outcome of a match. To give you a fighting chance though, hypercarries often have a comparatively poor baseline and an almost exclusively damage-oriented kit. They contribute very little utility to their team and can be easily shut down before they get a chance to scale. Such descriptions would appropriately correspond to Kassadin, right? Well, one other reason he was so popular back in the day was that Kassadin may very well have been the only champion in League of Legends history to not only be a hypercarry but also an anti-carry, two archetypes that normally would be antithetical to one another. Anti-carries are champions whose main way of carrying is by preventing the team's carries from carrying. How can a champion simultaneously 1v9 the game while stopping the enemy's 1v9 champion? That's what made Kassadin so effective. It's also the reason he had such a volatile balance history. Kassadin's hypercarry nature stems from the very aspect of his combat pressure increasing over time. Not only does he gain more damage through items and levels, but he also becomes more durable with the shield from Null Sphere scaling off ability power, which is then further enhanced by his passive Void Stone. Next, uptime. Kassadin's Force Pulse, both the original and current version, become more spammable whenever he or a nearby champion casts an ability. As champions put more levels into their skills and acquire ability haste, Kassadin can spam E much more frequently. Additionally, Riftwalk becomes faster as well, building on top of each other. On that note, Kassadin gains more mobility, being able to use Riftwalk every 2 seconds at rank 3. He becomes faster, tankier, and more mobile. It's also worth mentioning he has 4 damaging abilities, all with excellent AP ratios, or at least back then. Champions whose entire kits comprising damaging abilities tend to have lower ratios to even out how many times they can attack. For instance, another rushdown AP champ like Diana, her abilities only have around a 50 to 70% ratio, whereas Kassadin during his prime had AP scaling upwards of 90%. Point for point, he had some of the best scaling a champion could have, and when taking into account Force Pulse and Riftwalk's AoE pressure, Kassadin could nuke multiple champions at the same time while being extremely hard to catch due to his superior mobility. What made him double as an anti-carry were 3 things, first of which being that he possessed an innate advantage against AP champions. Void Stone flat out mitigates any magic damage he takes. Combine that with Null Sphere and he can face tank most mages without having to buy any magic resist. Secondly, Null Sphere, though it only applies to quarter-second silence now, at one point it used to silence for 2.5 seconds, rendering any skill-based hypercarry and even auto-attack hypercarry practically helpless for a painfully long time. Master Yi couldn't use Alpha Strike, Vayne couldn't dodge or peel with Tumble and Condemn, Syndra was a walking cannon minion, so on and so forth. Then he had a natural built-in counter against ability casters. The more they used their stuff, the more he could use Force Pulse to augment his own damage against them. All of these properties are still technically here today, but through balance changes and gradual systems adjustments, they became much less influential, bringing us to the first reason why his pick rate fell off so drastically. Kassadin not only lost his status as an anti-carry, but even his status as a hybrid carry, turning him from a champion who was once an incredible counterpick into just another AP skirmisher. Although must understand, he's still more than a threat if he reaches level 16, but in kind of a similar fashion to Kale's level 16 becoming less of an instant win condition, Kassadin was leveled out to be a more stable pick, despite his entire identity being associated with that. Establishing a bit of context, Prevailing Wisdom's aware of the growing damage and mobility creep that's been festering ever since the tank meta spanning seasons 5 through 7. Those who have been actively paying attention to version updates may have noticed every champion, namely AP scaling ones, have been getting higher and higher ratios over the years. Back in the day, you needed like 2 AP items to one-hit backline minions with your main wave clear tool. Now you see people doing it before that wave clear tool is even rank 5 and with just a lost chapter or something. Using Ahri as an example, Orb of Deception used to have a relatively subpar AP ratio of only 65% when combining both the way out and the return trip. Over time, it's been increased to 100%. Charm used to only have an AP ratio of 30 to 40%, now it's sitting at 75. Granted, I'm aware Charm used to have a damage amp on it, but even so, not just older champions, modern releases have also been getting insanely high scaling. Before losing AP ratios on all of his abilities in 14.15, Sylas's Q, W, and E had 130, 80, and 100% respectively, not even counting his passive or if he stole a damaging ultimate. There's an abundance of damage in this day and age, making Kassadin the champion who could 2-shot you, then 2-shot the person next to you, then 2-shot the person next to that person, go from a thing very few champions could do, into a thing everyone can do. Not just abundance of damage, there's an abundance of mobility. How many champs in the game now who can dash or blink as often as Kassadin while outputting similar 1v9 DPS? Ambessa, Cassante, Velvet, Gwen, Samira, Yone, Sylas, Neela, the Slayer category has been the fastest growing out of any class, each one stronger than the last. Ambessa is Kassadin with max health damage and bruiser itemization. Neela is Kassadin who can scale off crit items and gain more experience. Sylas is Kassadin who can steal ultimates and sustain. Gwen is Kassadin who can become untargetable and do max health and true damage. Velvet is Kassadin with an early game. Yone is f***ing bullshit. These champions not only contribute equal late game pressure to Kassadin, but half of them don't even have that bad of an early game, or they can provide utility for their team. The inverse is true as well. Kassadin basically lost most if not all of the properties that made him an anti-carry. Beginning with Voidstone, it used to mitigate 15% magic damage, now it's only 10. Null Sphere went from a 2.5 second silence to only lasting a quarter second. In fact, they don't even call it a silence anymore in the ability tooltip because of how short it is. Force Pulse was changed in 12.23 to go from an ability cast requisite to a standard cooldown. Though it ultimately follows the same principle of more abilities equals using more often, I would consider it a net nerf. For reference, before you needed 6 ability uses to activate Force Pulse. There was a base cooldown of 5 seconds, which at 40% CDR brought it to 3. Considering in the late game view and other champions can easily cast 6 abilities in 3 seconds, Force Pulse applicably had a 3-second cooldown. Now, however, Force Pulse has a 17-second cooldown at rank 5 and ability casts only refund 3/4 of a second. Assuming the same amount of ability haste to amount to 40% CDR bringing it to roughly 10 seconds, 6 ability uses would only bring it to a 5.5 second cooldown. That's assuming rank 13 when you have it maxed out. The original Force Pulse could be rank 1 and still have an effective 3-second cooldown. It also just did way more damage. Point being, there were 2 main draws to playing Kassadin, his amazing DPS and anti-carrying potential. That amazing DPS is no longer a novelty, with every champion having the capacity to output that much. Secondly, the anti-carry potential part of his kit was also shut down, making him feel like just a normal hyper carry. Thing is, compared to most 200 years champions, Kassadin might have their offensive pressure, but he has far more downside and volatility. League has never been more early game focused than it is right now, especially recently with the feats of strength and Otacon. The first 20 minutes of the game, which averages out to around level 13 to 14 by my estimate, is the most important part of the match. To Kassadin's credit, Riot made efforts to bring more base power into his kit so that even with just a rank 2 ultimate he can put up a decent fight, but it still doesn't change the fact that he's functionally useless before that point. Kassadin's basically not a champion until level 11, at which point a lot can happen that puts his team exceedingly far behind. The lack of agency Kassadin has in the early game renders him at the mercy of circumstance, which just isn't something people want to gamble their precious LP on, certainly not when more consistent alternatives exist. If you're looking for an AP skirmisher who scales well but has decent early game pressure, there's Sylas, Akali, Katarina to a lesser extent. Their late game might not be as strong as Kassadin, but it doesn't have to be. The early game holds more equity. For that matter, they can make up for their marginally weaker late game by securing objectives for their team, establishing an external stat lead that even a 6-item Kassadin will struggle to alleviate. The speed of a game's progression has accelerated at such a breakneck pace that 9 times out of 10 Kassadin doesn't have the luxury of sitting tight and farming for late game. He has tact now, yet lacks the means to do so. One thing that has improved over the years for him was item selection, with the reintroduction of Rod of Ages now granting a free level up after owning the item for 10 minutes, as well as Malignance offering ultimate ability haste. Kassadin can power spike reasonably well with either of those items, and Tesserus, granting him equal parts damage and durability, but items benefit all champions, it's not just him. And again, even with those stats, the lack of pressure it brings to the early game makes it easy for the enemy team to acquire a stat and macro advantage through Drakes, Herald, Grubs, Otacon, Baron, and whatnot to override any means of outscaling. But okay, let's entertain the possibility of him consistently attaining level 16 and 4 items to start 1v9ing the game. That's where we run into our third problem. No one can dispute that level 16 Kassadin is still a universal threat. Every time he gets close to that rank 3 ultimate, the opposing team feels a sense of urgency in ending the game so as to avoid potentially fighting a late game Cass. But late game Cass doesn't even feel like the scariest champion anymore, and that's because he isn't. What made him such a terror late game is how fast he can bypass your frontline and kill the 1 or 2 backline carries on the team, where you could then take his time clearing up stragglers like the support or tank top or underfunded jungler. Currently, however, you run into teams with 3, 4, or sometimes all 5 members being a threat to one's life. Even the full tank Sion or Orin can do a ton of damage. There is so much damage around that even if Kassadin can one-shot the enemy Caitlyn, he might still have to fight his way through a Riven top, Viego jungle, and a Syndra mid. Kassadin has good uptime, but he's no John Wick. He doesn't have the staying power to fight his way through that much DPS. In his defense, no one can. I'm not arguing Master Yi or any other hypercarry can fight their way out of a team comp like that, and of course he will have his teammates to back him up. I think a lot of that has to do with how linear he is too. For all the mobility he has, Kassadin's very much a stat checker. Null Sphere and Netherblade are both point and click. Voidstone literally stat checks magic damage. Force Pulse is practically impossible to miss, and Riftwalk is also really hard to react to with how fast it is. Riot can't exactly give him that much room for upside in light of how easy that upside is to exert on the enemy team. They can give a champion like Mbessa free armor penetration, battle healing, tons of max health damage, a humongous shield, 8 billion dashes, and no mana cost because she can theoretically miss all of her abilities. Were we to give the same privileges to Kassadin, he would destroy everyone, and there's empirical data to back that up, Season 3 and 4. Of course, there's a bit of recency bias. Kassadin is not exactly weak at the moment. He sits at around a 50.5% win rate give or take, so by all calculations he's in a very healthy spot. This is after suffering a bunch of nerfs back to back too. 14.21 lost AP ratios on his Q and D, 14.9 and 13.22 as well, then some more base damage and 13.3. Over the past 2 years, Kassadin received only nerfs, most of which were put in place to bounce out the insane power spike from Rod of Ages and Seraphs. Except those got nerfed too with no compensation buffs for Kassadin, but even if he did get compensation buffs, it still wouldn't fix the underlying issues of him having been power and feature crept. He still has a miserable early game that depends heavily on the jungler or support helping you out at their expense. He's still a liability if he falls behind as a result of not having anything to fall back on. If all else fails, Cassante can just be a me shield for the team, Mel can just be a reflector and poke bot, Gwen can tank shred, Viego can just become one of the fed members of the enemy team. Kassadin doesn't have a plan B. All he can hope for is one-shot someone on the enemy team or split push, but any member of his class can do that. Altogether, the main reason his peaks have been getting shorter and his valleys have been getting lower is due to the fact that Kassadin, like most other OG champions, has just gotten power and feature crept. Other champions are more fun, more dependable, can account for more contingencies and have more properties that ensure a guaranteed through line to late game. So with that said, what can be done to maybe bring him back to relevance in a way that doesn't return him to square one of being overpowered? I think he just needs a rework or like a mid-scope update. Something that makes him less 1v9 and more re-establishing his anti-mage identity. From a fundamental point of view, his kit isn't necessarily bad or annoying to deal with, but its one-dimensionality makes it prone to being overly reliant on him destroying you before you can destroy him. Perhaps a more engaging passive would be worthwhile to look into. But what about you guys? How would you modernize Kassadin? Do we give him a new kit entirely or just alter what he currently has? Let me know in the comments down below. That's it for today, so if you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe would be much appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other Why No One Plays episodes if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.